We want to welcome back to the program. We've got a lecturer of economics at the University of Central Arkansas. He's also affiliated researcher with the Arkansas Center for Research and Economics. Jacob Bundrick is back with us. Jacob, good morning, sir.
Good morning, Paul. Good to be with you this morning.
It's always great to talk to you, sir, and I appreciate the great work you do and the great work that ACRE does. I saw where you were quoted. The Arkansas Democrat-Gazette reached out to you about this Arkansas legislative audit concerning whether or not incentives to big companies to get them to move to Arkansas or stay to Arkansas actually work. And you made some great points, and you seem to disagree with the findings here. What's your primary concern from this Arkansas legislative audit?
Yeah, so my primary concern is that there's some assumptions that are in the model that ALA used to do this cost-benefit analysis. And the big thing here is that one of the difficult things with analyzing these programs is determining whether these incentives actually are the deciding factor in where a company decides to locate or expand. And the assumption made by ALA is that when they offer these incentives, they assume that the company would not have located in Arkansas or expanded in Arkansas if it had not been for that incentive, right? So we're just assuming that if it weren't for that incentive, that company would not have located here, right? And that changes the cost-benefit analysis pretty dramatically, right? And we know that this assumption is invalid.
Okay, let me actually read this. This is from the ALA's cost-benefit analysis. Quote, "It's likely then that the availability of statutory incentives will cause some companies to claim incentives for projects they would have pursued even without the incentives. However, for the purposes of this report, incentives were analyzed under the assumption that without the incentive, the corresponding economic activity would not have occurred." So they're doing a report based on whether or not incentives work or not, and the assumption is they work. So I would agree with you, that is an invalid assumption. It kind of torpedoes the accuracy of the entire report, doesn't it?
Right, it does. So the cost-benefit analysis, the way they're looking at this is how many tax dollars or how much tax dollars does the state get versus how many tax dollars they issue through these incentive programs. And when you assume that company would not have located here if it had not been for that incentive, it significantly increases that benefit that the state receives. But we know this is an invalid assumption because of both anecdotal evidence and empirical evidence. So in Arkansas, we've seen companies such as Pico Foods and Bad Boy Mowers who have actually come out and said publicly that, hey, yeah, we received these incentives, but that was not the deciding factor and where we located or where we chose to expand. All right, so they're saying that this is an incentive. We receive this incentive, but it's more or less a reward for doing what we intended to do, not necessarily the driving factor in what we're doing. We've seen it in other states. For instance, there was this summer we saw Nike in Arizona, where they had some other issues going on, kind of irritated the state government out there in Arizona, and Arizona decided to pool the company's incentives. And Nike said, well, we're going to go ahead and build the plant that we were planning on building anyway. So that shows you that, hey, these incentives didn't really matter for what Nike was doing, but they're not going to say no to them because it pads their bottom line. All right, and we've seen some other empirical evidence. So there's a really nice research center up in Michigan called the W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research, and they did a review of 30 empirical studies around the country, so different economists in different states looking at different programs. And they determined that for at least 75% of incented firms, the firm would have made similar location or expansion or retention decisions without the incentive. So 75% of the time that you're issuing those incentives, you don't really need to. It's not changing the company's decision. The company's already decided what they're going to do. So you're spending tax dollars needlessly to get activity that was going to happen anyway.
This flies in the face. We're talking with Arkansas Center for Research and Economics researcher Jacob Bundrick. This flies in the face of the predominant idea, which is companies must have the government giving them money in order to create jobs, and we won't be prosperous without doing this. And that's why I love your research, because this is what I've thought for a very, very long time. Also, I want to reiterate, kind of back towards you're talking about the anecdotal evidence. ALA highlights a specific company in their report, Company 29, invested $1.8 million in payroll over the course of the incentive project life and received only $18,000 back in incentives. And so this goes to your point, Jacob. Do we really think they did what they did for $18,000? Did that if you're going to spend $1.8 million to get $18,000, are we really going to say that the government's money had any impact on that at all?
It's really hard to say that's what's driving that company's decision. I think there's some speculation with that hey, this might not hold, and even ALA admits in that one might question how much the state's incentive payment actually affected the company's decision, and I think they're right to question that. I think in a lot of cases what we see is we have these statutory incentives where no matter what, if you meet certain thresholds, you qualify for this incentive. And a lot of companies are adept at understanding what incentives a state offers, and they're going to incorporate that in their decisions, just like ALA says. And it's not so much the driving factor, but if you're a company, as economists, we assume that companies are acting rationally to maximize their profits, and this is low-hanging fruit for them, right? So I don't necessarily blame the companies for doing this. They're trying to maximize their profits,
right?
But there's a problem with the institutions where we set up this environment where that's able to happen, right? So it's on the political institutions to change that so that these companies aren't out there just grabbing incentives for doing what they were going to do. All right, so here's an interesting thing. I want to throw this out there real quick. I mentioned that the empirical research says that about 75% of incented firms would have made the decision that they made without those incentives. So ALA reports that from 2009 through 2018, about $684 million were awarded from specific incentive programs in Arkansas. So if you can imagine that 75% of that is not necessary to get that economic activity, right? There's an extra $500 million in Arkansas's coffers to spend on other things like roads or education or whatever it might be, police officers or public defenders, whatever that might be, right? So we're spending $500 million that's unnecessary.
I can't. Yeah, that's a great point. 75% is essentially wasted according to this data here. You mentioned in the Gazette article about being politically connected, that tends to be the concern, like the fact that the government continues to pursue this as like its chief economic development philosophy. It kind of means that you've got these private businesses that are, they become kind of concerned with, getting politically connected. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. So one of the concerns that economists who research this have is that it's difficult for public officials because they don't have the same profit incentive that businesses have. It's difficult for government officials to pick and choose winners and losers. All right, there's a lot of different industries out there. It's hard to know where the markets are going. They don't have the same profit incentive that if we don't get this right, we're going to go out of business. Right? We're still going to pay our taxes. There's still going to be government funding, and they can do what they want to do with it. Right? But for businesses, all right, it is do or die. It is do or die. And one of the easy, low-hanging pieces of fruit that's out there to pad that bottom line are these incentives. All right, so the motives of business and government officials are very different. And so if you're a business and you're adept at understanding what these incentives are and what these different states offer, you're able to use that to your advantage, right? And you can buddy up with public officials in order to get these incentives. And you always hear about, well, hey, it's really competitive when we're trying to get these jobs and we're trying to get these companies to locate here. It's very competitive. Well, there's a reason that it's portrayed as very competitive, right? If I pit Arkansas against Mississippi and against Texas, that means I'm using that leverage to boost up those incentive packages that I get, right? So the incentives are very different for businesses who are trying to maximize profits and politicians who are trying to get reelected and demonstrate to constituents that, hey, we're doing something to boost the economy. And this is an easy lever to pull to show that they're doing something, right? We always see these ribbon cuttings. We see these news articles. We see the news cameras go out there, right? But the incentives are very different for why politicians are doing this and why businesses are doing it.
We're talking again with Jacob Bundrick from Arkansas Center for Research and Economics. Tell me about the Invest Arkansas program, Invest ARC. Do you have any concerns with that?
Yeah, so looking through the report, one of the things that stuck out to me from ALA's report is that to determine whether InvestArc is effective or not, ALA simply looked at whether or not the company that received the InvestArc incentive was still operating 5 years after they received the incentive, right? So they point out that this is a unique incentive in the fact that it's a retention incentive, meaning that it's given to companies that are already in Arkansas with the hope that giving this incentive will inspire them to stay here and not leave. And so they say that it's hard to determine what the impact is. So we look at it as just, well, is the company still here 5 years later, right? That's a really, I think, a really difficult way, or a really non-rigorous way of looking at whether this incentive actually was effective at accomplishing what it's intended to do. The one good thing I'll say about this is, even though a lot of the report focused on InvestArc incentives and a lot of companies that have received that award, the state did go back in the last couple of years here and phase out that incentive. There was a problem with the tax code about taxing business inputs, and so the legislature actually fixed that problem in the tax code, and that got rid of the need for InvestArc. But nevertheless, we've spent over the course of the last decade or so, we've spent as a state a lot of money on this program, right? A lot of money, hundreds of millions of dollars on this program. And so, determining whether or not this is effective by simply looking at whether a company who received it is still in business 5 years later is a very non-rigorous way at looking to see if this thing is actually doing what it's intended to do. So that one really concerns me.
Why is this? Let me just ask you this: do you think this is? It's very significant that state auditors are essentially saying that their government incentive packages, corporate welfare, is working. You say that it's not working the way they claim it is, and that's a big deal, right? I mean, we need to point that out, because it seems like, if you're right, Jacob, which I think you are, the government is just spinning its wheels. They're just wasting money.
Right. So I think it's really important to note here that there's a pretty large disconnect between what we see in anecdotal evidence with companies actually coming out and saying, hey, look, this didn't have any impact on our location or our expansion decisions, and what the empirical evidence says. Again, remember, 75%, on average, 75% of these incentives are unnecessary to get that economic activity that states are claiming is happening because of these incentives, right? So that is very different than what the state is claiming when they make the assumption that, hey, these incentives are the only thing that are causing the company, these companies to locate or expand here in Arkansas. That's a very large disconnect, and what that means is that the benefits that the state is attributing to these incentives is very inflated. All right, so if we are offering, hundreds of thousands of dollars or $1 million to a company that is going to do exactly as they plan to do, any tax revenue that we get, any jobs that are created from that, any investment that we get was already going to happen. That's not a benefit. That was going to happen anyway, right? We didn't need to give that $1 million. That $1 million is now a cost to taxpayers, right? And there's other things we could have done with that money. Like I said before, we could have, looked at addressing our road problem. We could have looked at addressing some education issues. We could have looked at 100 different problems where perhaps there's a bigger benefit. But when we inflate that cost, or that benefit, by assuming that's the driving factor in this company's decision, we're changing that investment scenario, right? And an easy way to think about it is, imagine you have two different investments to make. One for certain you'll get 3%. For certain it's a 3% return. The other investment option is really a 0% return. You don't get anything back, but you change some numbers, you change the way you think about it, and all of a sudden you make it a 5% return. It's not a real 5% return, but your analysis makes it that way. If you invest that money in that quote-unquote 5% return when it's in fact a 0% return, you're worse off than you would have been. You could have gotten 3%, but instead you're getting 0% because you've changed how you're looking at it to an incorrect manner.
Yeah. Yeah, and the government here is essentially grading their own paper, and it would be nice if we start measuring, the right outcomes. And I know that's what you've done here, Jacob. And
right.
I know I would love to see the state of Arkansas let the Arkansas Center for Research and Economics analyze this in its totality. Wouldn't you like that?
For selfish reasons, of course, right? But at the very least, I think we do have to increase the rigor that goes into these analyses, right? And there's lots of economists, not only in Arkansas, that can do this. There's lots of economists in other states that can take a look at this. And there's really some more rigorous ways to look at this to make sure that the assumptions are valid, so that we can actually see what these incentives are doing and what they're not doing, so that we can spend dollars appropriately. We can allocate our state's resources appropriately. And I think you hit on a big point there, that we have to ask ourselves if we're measuring the right outcomes, right? So this report looked primarily at how much in tax revenue do we get back when we issue these incentives. But I think it's important to keep in mind that the goal of these incentives is not to generate tax revenue, right? A lot of times these incentives are targeted at, hey, we want to stimulate job growth, or we want to stimulate investment. We want to stimulate income growth, right? We want to increase our gross state product, right? We want to lift people out of poverty. I think we have to be careful to measure those things. Are these incentives actually leading to increased activity in these arenas? And most of the empirical research to date says that they don't. Right, that they don't, and I understand that's a hard thing to swallow when you have this intent. You want to help people, and you see these ribbon cuttings, but we have to be very honest and very objective in our analyses of these programs, so that we can allocate our scarce tax dollars in the most efficient manner to get the most bang for our buck and to really improve the quality of life here in Arkansas.
Folks, he's a lecturer of economics at the University of Central Arkansas and a affiliated research for the Arkansas Center for Research and Economics, Jacob Bundrick. Jacob, I appreciate it, sir. Have a Merry Christmas.
Paul, I really appreciate the opportunity to come on and visit with you. Merry Christmas and happy holidays.
Absolutely. Jacob, thank you. Appreciate it, sir.